In every recorded human civilization in history, without a single exception, there has been a hierarchy. Every tribe, every village, every city, every empire, every modern democracy, every corporate office, every school, every family, always, without fail, some people end up at the top, some people end up at the bottom, and everyone in between spends a remarkable amount of energy figuring out exactly where they stand. Anthropologists call this universal. Psychologists call it hardwired. Philosophers have been calling it dangerous for 2,500 years. And the question worth asking, honestly, about yourself, not just about politicians and dictators, is this: how much of what you do every day is secretly about power, about position, about being seen as someone who matters, about making sure that the people around you know, in subtle ways or not so subtle ones, that you are not at the bottom, more than you think. Almost certainly more than you would like to admit. You probably do not think of yourself as someone who craves power. Power is for politicians, for executives, for people with obvious ambition and large egos. Not for you, but watch yourself for one day. Watch what happens when someone talks over you in a meeting and you feel that specific, sharp irritation. Watch what happens when someone younger or less experienced gets recognized for something you did first. Watch what happens when a stranger is rude to you in a way that makes you want instinctively to establish that you are not someone who can be treated that way. Watch what happens when your opinion is dismissed, when your effort goes unacknowledged, when someone walks into a room and immediately, instinctively, treats you as less important than the person standing next to you. That heat you feel, that tightening, that urge to correct the record, that is the power drive, not the dramatic throne room version. The everyday version, the one running quietly in the background of almost every social interaction you have ever had. It is not a flaw. It is not a failure. It is one of the oldest and most powerful forces in human psychology. And if you do not understand it, it will run your life without your permission, because the power drive, unexamined, does not announce itself. It disguises itself as justified anger, as reasonable ambition, as the simple desire for respect. And those things are not always wrong. But when you cannot tell the difference between wanting to be respected and needing to dominate, between healthy ambition and status addiction, between self-worth and ego, you are being steered by something you cannot see. Philosophy has been trying to make this visible for centuries. The first thinker we need is Friedrich Nietzsche. Again, Nietzsche is inescapable in this conversation because power was his central subject, not a side topic, the organizing principle of his entire philosophy. He argued that the fundamental drive in all living things, and in human beings especially, is what he called the will to power, not the will to survive, not the will to be comfortable, the will to grow, to expand, to overcome, to become more than you currently are. For Nietzsche, this was not a criticism, it was a description. It was simply what life does. Life pushes outward. Life seeks to increase itself. The will to power is as natural as hunger. But here is where it gets complicated. Nietzsche said there are two completely different expressions of this drive, and they produce two completely different kinds of human being. The first he called master morality. This is the will to power directed inward, the person who competes primarily with themselves, who measures their worth not against others but against their own previous limits, who seeks power not to dominate others but to develop themselves, who is genuinely indifferent to whether others are weaker or stronger, because that is simply not the measure they use. The second he called slave morality. This is the will to power directed outward, but twisted. The person who cannot feel strong without someone else feeling weak, who defines their worth entirely in relation to those around them, who needs hierarchy not to grow but to feel safe, who builds themselves up by tearing others down, sometimes openly, often quietly, often so subtly they do not recognize it themselves. He wrote, "The demand to be loved is the greatest of all arrogant presumptions." What he meant is that needing others to validate your worth, needing the approval, the recognition, the position, the status, is a form of dependency that masquerades as confidence. It looks like strength. It is a kind of fragility. The genuinely powerful person, for Nietzsche, does not need you to acknowledge their power. They are too busy using it. Now here is where Plato enters. And his diagnosis is darker. Plato watched democracy in Athens, a city full of citizens competing for status, for influence, for the admiration of the crowd. And he saw something that disturbed him deeply. He argued in the Republic that the soul has three parts: reason, appetite, and what he called thumos. Thumos is one of those Greek words that does not translate cleanly. It is usually rendered as spirit or spiritedness, but what it really means is the part of you that cares about honor, about recognition, about your standing in the eyes of others, the part that feels shame when you are humiliated and swells when you are praised, the part that cannot stand to be disrespected. Plato said thumos is not entirely bad. In its right place, it produces courage, dignity, the refusal to be treated unjustly. A person with healthy thumos stands up for themselves and for others. They have standards. They have pride in the right sense. But thumos out of control, thumos that has escaped the guidance of reason, produces something else entirely. It produces the tyrant. The person so consumed by the need for recognition, so unable to tolerate any challenge to their position, so driven by the fear of being seen as weak, that they will destroy everything around them to maintain the feeling of being above it. Plato saw this not just in obvious tyrants. He saw it in democratic politics, in ambitious men using the assembly as a stage for their own glory, in the way crowds could be manipulated by appealing to their collective thumos, their shared need to feel powerful, important, chosen. He wrote, "The excessive desire for liberty and disregard of everything else leads people to demand and crave more and more liberty until it passes into tyranny." He meant that societies driven by the need for status, for recognition, for dominance, for the feeling of being above someone, tend not toward freedom but toward its opposite, toward the strong man who promises to make everyone feel powerful by making someone else feel weak. 2,500 years ago, about our world, Thomas Hobbes arrives with the coldest view of all. Hobbes was a 17th-century English philosopher. He lived through a civil war. He watched a king be executed. He watched a society tear itself apart. And he emerged from that experience with a view of human nature so bleak it has never entirely been refuted. He argued that in the natural state of human beings, without law, without government, without social structure, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Why? Because human beings, left without external restraint, compete endlessly for power, not just the power to survive, the power to feel safe. And to feel safe, Hobbes argued, you need not just enough power but more power than the person next to you. Because if they have more than you, they are a threat. So the drive for power is not, in Hobbes's view, simply vanity. It is fear. The deep structural fear of being vulnerable, of being at someone else's mercy. The craving for power is the craving for safety in a world where safety is never guaranteed. He wrote, "I put for a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power, that ceaseth only in death. That is not a flattering portrait of our species, but consider whether it is recognizable. Consider the person who has accumulated more money than they could ever spend and cannot stop accumulating. The executive who has reached the top and becomes more anxious, not less. The person who wins an argument and immediately starts looking for the next one." Hobbes would say, they are not greedy, they are afraid. They are doing what the species learned to do over millions of years of actual danger. The environment has changed. The drive has not. Here is what neuroscience confirms. Research by social neuroscientist Michael Graziano and studies of primate behavior by primatologist Franz de Waal have established something important. Status is not a luxury. For social mammals, including humans, status is functionally equivalent to safety. In primate groups, low-status individuals show chronically elevated cortisol levels, the stress hormone. They get sick more often. They recover more slowly. They have shorter lifespans. High-status individuals show the opposite pattern. The brain, it turns out, processes social rejection and physical pain in the same regions. Being excluded, humiliated, or relegated to low-status registers in your nervous system as a genuine threat, not a metaphorical threat, a physiological one. This is why the power drive feels so urgent. It is not vanity. At the level of your nervous system, it is survival. But here is what the research also shows. The relationship between status and well-being is not linear. After a basic threshold of social security, after you feel reasonably respected, reasonably included, reasonably safe in your social world, additional status produces rapidly diminishing returns on actual well-being. The anxiety does not decrease as status increases. For many people, it increases because there is more to lose, and because the drive was never really about status. It was always about safety, and no amount of status ever finally produces the feeling of being safe. The philosopher's question is, what would it take to feel safe without needing to be above? So, what do you actually do with all of this? Today, specifically, the first practice is Nietzsche's. For 1 week, every time you feel the competitive sting, the irritation when someone else is praised, the quiet satisfaction when someone else fails, the need to correct someone who has made you look less than you are, pause before responding. Ask one question: am I trying to grow, or am I trying to dominate? The answer will not always be comfortable. That discomfort is the beginning of the shift from slave morality to master morality, from competing with others to competing with yourself. The second practice comes from Plato and his concept of thumos. Think of one relationship in your life where you suspect your need for recognition is causing damage. A relationship where you keep score, where you cannot let things go, where being right matters more than being close. Write down what you are actually afraid of in that relationship, not what you want, what you fear. Almost always, underneath the power struggle, there is a fear of being seen as less than, of being dismissed, of not mattering. Name the fear instead of acting it out. You cannot manage what you have not named. The third practice is the Stoic one. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called the view from above. When you feel the status anxiety rising, when the hierarchy feels threatened, when the recognition feels insufficient, ask this: in 10 years, will this moment of dominance or submission have mattered? In 100 years, will anyone know the difference? This is not nihilism. It is perspective. It is a reminder that the hierarchy you are fighting so hard to maintain exists inside a very small room in a very large universe. Most of what we compete for so desperately is temporary, local, and largely invisible to anyone not standing in that specific room with us. Here is what I want you to carry from today. The hunger for power is not a personality flaw. It is not something that only corrupt people feel. It is as human as hunger, as old as language, as present in you as in every politician or tyrant you have ever shaken your head at. Nietzsche said the will to power is simply what life is. Plato said thumos, misdirected, destroys both the person and the society. Hobbes said the drive never stops because the fear behind it never fully resolves. And all three of them, in their different ways, are pointing at the same question. The question is not whether you crave power. You do. We all do. The question is what you do with it. Whether you turn it outward, needing others to be smaller so you can feel larger. Or whether you turn it inward, using it to become more honest, more capable, more genuinely yourself. The person who needs to be feared is always afraid. The person who needs to be obeyed is always insecure. The person who needs to be above is always, in the place that matters, below. Real power, the kind that does not depend on anyone else's weakness, looks nothing like what we usually call power. It looks like someone who does not need you to know how powerful they are.